Hello, and welcome to the Self-Harm Learning Network's workshop. This session is delivered as a part of the West Sussex Mind program, and it brings together professionals working with children and young people across education, health, and community settings. Today's session focuses on self-harm, how we understand it, how we respond to it, and how we support young people safely and compassionately within the roles we hold. The aim today is not to turn you into mental health specialists, but to strengthen understanding, confidence, and relational responses when the self-harm appears in your work. The Self-Harm Learning Network has two main aims. The first aim is to provide a space to discuss and share practical strategies to support young people who self-harm. These strategies may differ across settings, but they are grounded in relationship, consistency, and realistic practice rather than idealized responses. The second aim is to signpost resources which can support young people who self-harm and their families. Families and carers often feel unsure where to turn. Clear, calm signposting can reduce fear and help people feel less alone. Before I continue, it is important to talk about taking care of ourselves today. Triggers are sensory stimuli that can cause an intense emotional or physical reaction by reminding someone of a past traumatic event. Triggers are often unpredictable and deeply personal. Today we will be discussing many aspects of mental health that may resonate with challenges that you or your family may be facing, either now or in the past. We want you to stay well. Please feel free to opt out of any session, pause the recording, or take any necessary steps to look after your own mental health. Stepping away is not avoidance. It is a regulated and responsible response. This image reflects how self-harm often exists alongside confusion, uncertainty, and unanswered questions. For many young people, self-harm is not about wanting to die, but about wanting something to change, stop, or feel manageable again. Holding this understanding helps us respond with curiosity rather than fear. This slide summarizes key findings from the Children's Commissioner's Mental Health Report for 2023-2024, and it helps us understand the wider context in which self-harm is appearing. In this reporting year, 58,200 young people were referred for support from CAMHS. This was an increase of over 9,000 compared to the previous year and represents approximately 8% of all children in England. The reasons for these referrals included anxiety, suspected neurodevelopmental conditions, excluding autism, suspected autism, and young people representing in crisis. These figures alone tell us that emotional distress among children and young people is both widespread and complex. What is particularly important for those of us working in schools and community settings is what happened after referral. Of all referrals, 31% were closed without treatment being offered. 36% of young people began treatment. 33% were still waiting for treatment after a year. This means that a significant number of young people are either not receiving specialist support at all, or are waiting for long periods while their distress continues. In practice, this often means that schools, colleges, and community services are holding risk, emotion, and self harm over extended periods of time, sometimes with limited external support. This context matters because it helps us move away from individual blame. When self harm appears more frequently, it is not simply about individual vulnerability. It is also about systems under pressure and gaps in timely care. Understanding this broader picture can help staff feel less isolated and more realistic about what is possible, while still recognizing the importance of the role they play in providing stability, relationship, and early support. This slide refers to a post shared by Young Minds about the rollout of mental health support teams, often referred to as MHSTS. The announcement states that every pupil in England will have access to a mental health support team by 2029 or 2030, with around 60% of pupils having access by 2026. Mental health support teams are made up of trained professionals who work in and alongside schools. Their role is to identify and support children and young people experiencing mild to moderate mental health difficulties and to offer early intervention where possible. This development is an important and welcome step. Earlier access to support can reduce escalation and help some young people receive help before they reach crisis point. At the same time, it is important to be realistic about what MHSTS can and cannot do. They do not replace specialist mental health services, and they do not remove the need for emotionally informed practice across the whole school. Relationships, staff confidence, school culture, and a sense of psychological safety remain central. Even with additional support teams, young people are still most likely to talk first to someone they trust. This slide is a reminder that while services matter, how we respond day to day continues to make a significant difference. This slide invites us to pause and reflect on the question: which successful strategies do you currently use in your work to support young people who self-harm? When we talk about success here, it's important to think broadly. Success does not always mean that self-harm has stopped. It may mean that a young person feels safer, less isolated, or more able to talk about what they are experiencing. The strategies you use may be formal, such as safety plans, well-being check-ins, or referral pathways. They may also be informal, being a consistent adult, noticing changes early, or creating space for a young person to be heard. As you reflect, try to focus on what actually works in your settings, rather than what feels ideal or expected. You may find it helpful to notice small, everyday actions that support young people, as these are often the foundations of trust and safety. If you are watching this as a recording, you might pause briefly here and note one or two strategies that you feel make a real difference in your work. This slide invites us to think honestly about barriers. The question is, what are the barriers to supporting young people who self-harm in your setting? When we talk about the barriers, we are not talking about individual failure or lack of care. Most barriers exist at systemic, structural, or cultural level, and naming them helps reduce the sense of personal responsibility that many staff carry. One common barrier is time. Conversation about self-harm rarely fit neatly into timetables, lesson slots, or appointment windows. Distress often shows up at moments when there is no obvious space to hold it. Another barrier is confidence and training. Many staff worry about saying the wrong thing, making the things worse, or triggering safeguarding processes as they feel unprepared to manage. This anxiety can lead to avoidance even when care is present. Safeguarding thresholds can also feel like a barrier. Staff may feel caught between wanting to respond relationally and feeling pressure to escalate quickly, sometimes before a young person feels ready or safe enough to engage. There may also be uncertainty about roles and boundaries. Questions such as, what is my responsibility here? What sits within my role and what doesn't? When do I hold and when do I refer? Can create hesitation and stress. Service availability and waiting times are another significant barrier. Knowing that referrals may not lead to timely support can leave staff feeling that they are holding risk without adequate backup. Cultural factors within a setting can also act as barriers. If self-harm is treated as something to be avoided, silenced, or quickly passed on, young people may learn that it is not safe to talk about what they are experiencing. I want to emphasize this clearly. Barriers do not mean you're doing a bad job. They are signals of pressure points within systems, not indicators of individual inadequacy. As you reflect on this question, notice which barriers feel most present for you right now. Naming them, even privately, can be a first step toward more sustainable and compassionate practice, both for young people and for staff. This slide signposts the e-well-being self-harm resources. These resources are designed specifically for young people and focus on emotional well-being, self-harm, and coping strategies in a clear and accessible way. They include practical tools such as short activities, worksheets, and emotion tracking exercises that help young people notice what they are feeling and what helps when things become difficult. One of the strengths of these resources is that they can be used between conversations. They give young people something supportive to return to outside of school hours or structured support. The tone throughout is non-judgmental and age-appropriate, which can make it easier for young people to engage without feeling blamed or overwhelmed. These resources work best as a complement to relational support rather than a replacement for conversation. This slide points to the e-well-being self-harm resources. These resources are designed directly for young people and include clear information about self-harm, emotional well-being, and coping strategies. They offer practical tools such as worksheets, emotional trackers, and activities that can help young people understand and manage their feelings. Resources like these can be particularly helpful between conversations, giving young people something to return to when support is not immediately available. The tone is accessible and non-judgmental, which can make it easier for young people to engage and feel less alone. This slide highlights an important resource, Young People Who Self-Harm, a guide for school staff. This guide is designed specifically for educational settings where staff are often supporting young people outside of clinical services. It provides clear practical guidance on what self-harm is and why it happens, how to respond to disclosures, how to manage confidentiality, and how to balance care with safeguarding responsibilities. The language is accessible and reassuring, which makes it useful for staff who may feel anxious or unsure. This resource can be particularly helpful for new staff or as a shared reference point to support consistent responses across a school or college. Discussion points. Since September, have you noticed any themes or groups of young people who have been more likely to self-harm? Do all new staff in your school know how to talk to children who self-harmed? Have you found any resources or services since your last community of practice? These questions remind us that learning in this area needs to be ongoing. This slide focuses on safety plans, which are commonly used when supporting young people who self-harm. A safety plan is a collaborative tool created with a young person. It is not something that is done to them, but something that is developed with them. The purpose of a safety plan is to help a young person recognize when things are becoming difficult, identify what helps them cope, and clarify where support can be found, both inside and outside of this setting. It is important to be clear about what safety plans are not. A safety plan is not a contract or promise that self-harm will stop. A safety plan is not a disciplinary or behavioral management tool. A safety plan is not a guarantee of safety. And a safety plan is not a replacement for clinical assessment or specialist support. When safety plans are misunderstood or misused, they can feel controlling or punitive. When used well, they can increase a young person's sense of agency, clarity, or containment. A safety plan usually includes several key elements. One element is recognizing early warning signs. These might include changes in mood, thoughts, behavior, or physical sensations that signal things are becoming overwhelming. Another element is identifying internal coping strategies. These are things the young person can do on their own to reduce distress, such as grounding techniques, distraction, movement, creative activities, or sensory strategies. Safety plans also include external supports. These may involve identifying trusted adults, peers, or services the young person can contact when they are struggling. It is important that these support are realistic and available rather than idealized or theoretical. A further element is environmental safety. These may involve thinking about how access to means is managed, in collaboration with families or carers where appropriate, and in line with safeguarding procedures. Safety plans should be simple, personalized, and accessible. Overly complex plans are difficult to remember and use when a young person is distressed. They should also be reviewed regularly. A plan that made sense at one point may no longer feel helpful as circumstances change. Reviewing a plan together communicates that support is ongoing and responsive. Perhaps most importantly, the relationship around the safety plan matters as much as the plan itself. A safety plan is only as effective as the trust and collaboration that underpin it. Creating a safety plan can be an opportunity to model calm, non-judgmental engagement. It allows a young person to feel heard, taken seriously, and supported, rather than monitored or controlled. Finally, it's important to remember that safety plans sit within a wider system of care. They do not remove the need for supervision, safeguarding processes, or referral to other services when risk escalates. Used thoughtfully, safety plans can be a containing and empowering tool. Used without care, they can add pressure. Our task is to use them in a way that prioritizes safety, dignity, and relationship. When a young person first tells someone about self-harm, the way that conversation is handled can have a lasting impact. Not because we say the perfect thing, but because we communicate whether it is safe to talk. One important piece of advice is to stay calm. Even if you feel shocked or worried internally, a calm tone and steady presence help the young person regulate. Strong reactions can increase shame or fear and may shut the conversation down. Another key principle is to listen more than you speak. You do not need to gather every detail in the first conversation. Allowing space, silence, and pauses helps a young person feel heard rather than interrogated. It is also important to avoid judgment or minimization. Statements such as, "It is not that bad," "Others have it worse," "You should just stop it," can feel invalidating even if well intended. Equally, avoid making the conversation about rules or consequences too quickly. While safeguarding responsibilities are real, moving immediately into procedures can feel overwhelming and may prevent further disclosure. A helpful approach is to acknowledge what the young person has shared. For example, "I'm really glad you told me. That sounds really hard. Thank you for trusting me with this." Be honest about your role and boundaries. If you cannot promise confidentiality, it's better to explain this gently and clearly than to avoid the conversation altogether. Transparency builds trust, even when information needs to be shared. Another important piece of advice is to focus on the present moment. You don't need to explore the whole history of self-harm in an initial conversation. Staying with what is happening now helps keep the discussion contained and manageable. It can also be helpful to check what the young person wants from the conversation. You might ask, "What feels the most helpful right now for you?" Or, "Are you looking for advice, or do you just want someone to listen?" Avoid making promises you cannot keep. Promising that everything will be fixed or that support will be immediate can lead to disappointment and loss of trust if systems cannot respond quickly. Finally, remember that one conversation does not have to do everything. Your role may be simply to open the door, reduce isolation, and help the young person feel less alone. Ending the conversation with a sense of continuity can be helpful. For example, we can keep talking about this. We'll think about next steps together. You don't have to handle this on your own. These small relational messages often matter more than any simple piece of advice. Now we are talking about myths regarding self-harm. So the first myth is one of the most common and one of the most anxiety-provoking. The idea that self-harm is always a suicide attempt. It is important to say clearly, self-harm and suicide are related, but they are not the same thing. Self-injury does not simply follow a wish to die or to cause serious injury to oneself. For many people, self-harm is not about wanting life to end, but about wanting intense emotional pain to stop, shift, or become manageable. In this sense, self-harm can be understood as a coping strategy, even though it is harmful one. It is often used when others' ways of managing feelings feel unavailable, ineffective, or unsafe. The slide describes self-harm as embodied communication, and this is a helpful way to understand it. When emotions feel overwhelming, confusing, or out of control, the body can become the place where distress is expressed. For some young people, self-harm provides a sense of release. The physical sensation can temporarily interrupt emotional overload and bring a short-lived feeling of calm, grounding, or self-soothing. For others, self-harm may be a way of feeling something when they feel numb, disconnected, or deassociated. In these moments, pain can confirm that they are still real, still present, still alive. Importantly, understanding self-harm in this way does not mean minimizing risk. Self-harm can escalate over time, injuries can become more severe, and there is a known association between ongoing self-harm and increased suicide risk. However, if we assume that every act of self-harm is a suicide attempt, our responses may become driven by fear rather than understanding. Fear-based responses can unintentionally shut down conversation, increase secrecy, heighten shame, and reduce a young person's willingness to seek help. A more helpful stance is one of curious seriousness. Taking self-harm seriously while also being curious about what it is doing for the young person at this moment in time. Questions such as, what does this help with? What was happening just before? What did it change, even briefly? Can guide understanding without assuming intent. Holding this distinction allows us to respond with compassion and containment while still staying alert to risk and safeguarding responsibilities. In short, recognizing that self-harm is not always a suicide attempt helps us move from panic to presence. And presence is often what allows young people to keep talking. The second myth, that self-harm is attention-seeking, is one of the most damaging and silencing beliefs young people encounter. When we hear the phrase attention-seeking, it is often used dismissively, as though the behavior is manipulative, exaggerated, or not genuine. In reality, Self-harm is not about attention seeking. It may, however, be about attachment seeking, a need to be seen, held in mind, or responded to when internal distress feels unbearable. For many young people, self-harm emerges in contexts where emotional needs feel unmet, unsafe to express, or repeatedly ignored. In this case, self-harm can be understood as communication of need when other forms of communication have not worked or do not feel possible. This slide lists several reasons why a person might self-harm, and it is important to sit with these carefully. So, self-harm may be a way of expressing rage or distress that feels unacceptable or dangerous to show outwardly. Gaining a sense of control when life feels chaotic or overwhelming. Punishing oneself in response to shame, guilt, or self-criticism. Communicating a need for care, closeness, or support. Bringing oneself back into the present moment during dissociation. Stopping oneself from acting on urges to hurt others. Managing overwhelming emotions linked to trauma. None of these motivations are trivial. They reflect attempts to survive emotionally when internal resources are stretched or depleted. When self-harm is labeled as attention-seeking, several things can happen. First, the young person may feel dismissed or invalidated, reinforcing beliefs that their feelings do not matter. Second, shame often increases, which can push the behavior underground and make it more dangerous. Third, the opportunity for understanding and support is lost because the focus shifts from meaning to judgment. It can be helpful to reframe the idea of attention seeking as support seeking. If a young person is seeking attention through self-harm, this may be because attention, in the form of care, concern, and connection, is something they urgently need. From this perspective, the question becomes not how do we stop this behavior, but what need is being expressed here, and how else might it be met? This does not mean reinforcing self-harm, excusing it, or ignoring safeguarding responsibilities. It means responding with curiosity rather than contempt, and with care rather than correction. When young people feel that their distress is taken seriously without being judged, they are more likely to talk openly and less likely to rely on self-harm as their only form of expression. Challenging this myth helps create environments where young people do not have to hurt themselves in order to be noticed. This next myth is the belief that self-harm only means cutting. Cutting is often the behavior people think of first, partly because it is more visible and more widely talked about. However, self-harm is a much broader term. Self-harm refers to deliberate physical harm used as a way of managing emotional distress, overwhelming feelings, or internal states that feels unmanageable. The slide distinguishes between direct and indirect forms of self-harm, and this distinction is important for understanding how distress can present in different ways. Direct forms of self-harm include behaviors where harm to the body is immediate and intentional. This may include cutting or scratching the skin, burning, hair pulling, headbanging, overdosing, suicide attempts, or self-injury without suicidal intent. These forms are often easier to recognize because they leave physical marks or injuries. Indirect forms of self-harm involve behaviors that are harmful to the body over time, even if harm is not the stated intention. These may include substance or alcohol misuse, restricting food or binge eating, over-exercising, sexual risk-taking, digital self-harm such as sending oneself abusive messages, initiating fights or dangerous situations where injury is likely. These behaviors may not be immediately recognized as self-harm, particularly if they are normalized within peer culture or wider society. Understanding self-harm in this broader way helps us notice distress that might otherwise be missed, especially in young people who do not engage in more visible forms like cutting. It is also important to recognize that young people may move between different forms of self-harm over time. A behavior may change as circumstances change, access changes, or as young people experiment with different ways of coping. Focusing only on one form of self-harm can lead to a narrow response where concern decreases if visible injuries reduce, even though distress remains. Taking a broader view allows us to stay curious about function rather than form. Instead of asking, what behavior is this? We can ask, what is this behavior helping the young person manage right now? This approach supports more accurate understanding and more compassionate responses, while still maintaining appropriate safeguarding awareness. Challenging this myth reminds us that self-harm does not always look the same, and that distress can take many different forms. This next myth is the belief that self-harm is something that only happens in adolescence. While it is true that self-harm often begins during the teenage years, it is important to understand that people can engage in self-harm at any stage of life. Self-harm is not defined by age. It is defined by how distress is being managed when internal or external pressures become overwhelming. Adolescence is a period of rapid emotional, social, and neurological change, which is why self-harm may first appear during this time. However, the underlying vulnerabilities do not automatically disappear with age. For some people, self-harm continues into adulthood. For others, it may re-emerge later in life during periods of stress, loss, or transition. This slide highlights several possible triggers, and it is helpful to slow down and consider these. Self-harm may be triggered by unresolved early trauma that becomes activated later in life. It may also follow experiences of loss or grief, where emotional pain feels too intense or complex to hold. Relationship difficulties can be another trigger, particularly where attachment needs are threatened or unmet. Struggles with gender identity, sexual orientation can increase vulnerability, especially in environments where there is limited understanding of or acceptance. School or work pressures, including academic expectations, performance demands, or fear of failure, can also contribute to overwhelm. Financial strain and instability can add further pressure, particularly for adults who feel responsible for others. Understanding that self-harm can occur across their lifespan helps us avoid minimizing distress based on age. It also reminds us that self-harm is not something young people simply grow out of without support. This myth can be particularly unhelpful in settings where distress in adults is overlooked or where self-harm in older young people is seen as less serious. Challenging this belief allows us to respond to self-harm as a signal of distress that deserves attention, care, and understanding, regardless of age. This next myth is the belief that self-harm mainly affects white teenage girls. It is true that girls are statistically more likely to report self-harm than boys, particularly during adolescence. However, this myth is harmful because it creates a very narrow picture of who self-harms and who gets noticed. When we hold a stereotype of what self-harm looks like, we risk overlooking distress in young people who do not fit that image. Self-harm occurs across gender, cultures, ethnicities, and backgrounds. The slide highlights several groups who may be particularly vulnerable, and it is important to name these clearly. Young people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, gender fluid, or questioning are at increased risk of self-harm. This vulnerability is not because of their identity, but because of the stress, discrimination, rejection, or isolation they may experience. Children and young people who have experienced trauma, neglect, or abuse are also at higher risk. For these young people, self-harm may become a way of managing overwhelming emotions, regaining a sense of control, or coping with feelings or shame. Social isolation is another significant risk factor. Young people who feel disconnected from peers, family, or community may use self-harm as a way of coping with loneliness or feeling unseen. The slide also highlights people who are bereaved by suicide. Experiencing suicide loss can increase vulnerability to self-harm through grief, shock, guilt, and identification with the deceased. It is also important to recognize recent changes in patterns of self-harm. There has been a noticeable increase in self-harm among Black and South Asian young people, as well as those from other non-white ethnic groups. This increase may reflect multiple factors, including social pressures, racism, barriers to accessing culturally appropriate support, or reluctance to disclose distress due to stigma. Gender stereotypes can also affect how self-harm presents and how it is recognized. Boys and young men may be less likely to disclose self-harm or may express distress throughout indirect forms such as risk-taking or substance use, which can be overlooked. When self-harm does not fit the expected pattern, it may be minimized, misinterpreted, or missed entirely. Challenging this myth encourages us to widen our lens. It invites us to ask who fits this not sorry it invites us to ask not who fits the stereotype, but who might be struggling beneath the surface. By holding a more inclusive understanding of self-harm, we increase the chances that all young people, regardless of background or identity, are seen, taken seriously, and supported. This final myth is the belief that superficial self-injury is not a serious problem. This myth is particularly dangerous because it encourages comparison, comparing wounds, comparing severity, and comparing levels of concern rather than understanding distress. The severity of physical injury does not reflect the depth of emotional pain. A young person may injure themselves in ways that appear minor on surface while experiencing profound internal distress, hopelessness, or emotional overwhelm. Self-harm should never be assessed only by what is visible on the body. Emotional pain is not measurable by the depth of wound or the amount of blood or the frequency of injury. This slide reminds us that all self-harm should be taken seriously. This means injuries should be cared for medically when needed. Distress should be acknowledged rather than minimized. And responses should be grounded in compassion and curiosity, not judgment. When self-harm is dismissed as superficial, young people may receive the message that their pain does not matter or that they need to hurt themselves more severely to be taken seriously. This can unintentionally increase risk of over time. It is also important to recognize that the meaning of self-harm can change. What self-harm was helping with at one point may no longer be the same later on. A young person's reasons for self-harm may evolve as circumstances, relationships, and internal status change. For this reason, previous assessments and assumptions may no longer be accurate. Each episode of self-harm needs to be understood within its current content rather than assumed to follow a fixed pattern. Responding to superficial self-injury with seriousness does not mean overreacting or escalating unnecessarily. It means staying engaged, asking thoughtful questions, and recognizing that any act of self-harm is a signal that something is not manageable for the young person in that moment. This approach helps create environments where young people do not feel they need to prove their pain through escalation. Challenging this myth supports safer practice by shifting the focus away from injury severity and toward meaning, context, and support. Before we move on to support pathways and practical next steps, I want to pause and bring together what we've covered across the myth section. We explored several common myths about self-harm, not to overload you with information, but to gently challenge ideas that can shape how we respond, often without us realizing. Across all of these myths, one central message stands out. Self-harm is a response to distress, not a character flaw or a behavior to be judged. We've seen that self-harm is not always a suicide attempt, even though it must be taken seriously. It can be a way of coping with emotions that feel overwhelming, unmanageable, or impossible to express. We've challenged the idea that self-harm is attention-seeking and instead considered how it may be a communication of unmet needs, attachment needs, or a desire to be seen and supported. We widened our understanding of what self-harm can look like, recognizing that it is not limited to cutting and that distress may show up in many different forms. We've also challenged assumptions about who self-harms, recognizing that it occurs across ages, genders, ethnicities, and backgrounds, and that stereotypes can cause some young people to be overlooked. Finally, we've addressed the myth that superficial self-injury is not serious, reminding ourselves that the depth of emotional pain cannot be measured by the severity of physical injury. Taken together, these myths show us how easily fear, misunderstanding, or oversimplification can shape responses. When myths dominate, responses often become reactive, driven by panic, control, or avoidance. When understanding replaces myth, responses can become more thoughtful, proportionate, and relational. This does not mean lowering our awareness of risk or stepping away from safeguarding responsibilities. It means responding in a way that keeps young people talking rather than shutting down communication. As professionals, we don't need to hold all of this perfectly. What matters is being willing to reflect, question assumptions, and stay open to learning. This slide acts as a bridge from understanding why self-harm happens to thinking about what support looks like and where responsibility sits. With this foundation in place, we can now turn our attention to practical support pathways, knowing that our responses are grounded not in myth, but in compassion, realism, and care. This slide focuses first on non-crisis support, and the first point of contact highlighted here is the GP. Starting with the GP is often appropriate when a young person is experiencing ongoing distress or self-harm, but is not at immediate risk. GP play an important role in monitoring mental health over time, making referrals to specialist services, coordinating care, and supporting families to navigate the system. Encouraging families to involve the GP can help ensure concerns are documented and followed up, even when waiting times for other services are long. It is important to remember that non-crisis does not mean no distress. It simply means that immediate emergency intervention may not be required at the moment. Clear guidance about when and how to involve the GP can reduce uncertainty for both staff and families. The slide also outlines crisis support options, which are essential to be clear about. In crisis situation, young people, families, and carers need access to immediate emotional support. The slide highlights Samaritans available on 116 123 24 hours a day. Samaritans offer a listening service. They do not give advice or make assessments. They provide space to talk, be heard, and feel less alone during moments of acute distress. The National Suicide Prevention Helpline, available on 0800 689 5652 from 6 p.m. to midnight, is another key resource. This service offers immediate support during high-risk periods and can be particularly helpful when someone feels unsafe or overwhelmed. These helplines are not only for young people. Parents, carers, and professionals can also use them for support or guidance when worried about someone else. Sharing these options calmly and clearly helps reduce fear and supports safer decision-making in moments of crisis. This slide also highlights Mind helplines and listening service. Mind offers information, emotional support, and signposting for people experiencing mental health difficulties, as well as for those supporting them. These services can be especially helpful when someone feels unsure where to turn or when they need support that sits between everyday conversation and crisis intervention. Mind also provides accessible information about mental health rights and services, which can help reduce confusion and empower people to seek appropriate support. Signposting to services like Mind can be a valuable part of ongoing support, particularly during long waiting periods for specialist care. This slide brings together a number of useful organizations that provide support information and help for young people, families, and professionals in relation to self-harm, emotional distress, and safeguarding concerns. We've already talked about Samaritans and Mind. The next would be Harmless. Harmless is an organization that specializes in support, information, training, and consultancy around self-harm. They can be contacted via email or through their website. Harmless offers specialist knowledge and is often used by professionals as well as individuals seeking support. So the next one is Young Minds. Is a national charity focused on fighting for young people's mental health. Their website provides information, resources, and guidance for young people, parents, and professionals. Young Minds is particularly useful for understanding mental health from a young person's perspective and for supporting families to navigate concerns. The next organization is Childline, is free confidential service for children and young people. They can be contacted by phone on 08001111, and support is available online or by phone at any time. Childline offers a space for young people to talk about worries, including self-harm, without needing parental involvement. The slide also includes NSPCC. This organization provides support and advice around safeguarding and child protection. They can be contacted by phone on 0808800500 or through their website. The NSPCC is particularly relevant for professionals and adults who are worried about a child and need advice on next steps or safeguarding concerns. Finally, the slide highlights Switchboard, the LGBT plus helpline. Switchboard provides support specifically for LGBT plus individuals. So they are available from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. every day or through their website. Knowing about this organization and knowing when to suggest them helps ensure that young people, families, and professionals are not left holding distress alone. Knowing what is available locally and how to access it helps professionals respond with confidence rather than uncertainty. It's also important to think how we share this information, and signposting should feel like an extension of care, not a way of passing responsibility on. And we have another slide about apps. So this slide highlights several apps that can be used as additional support for young people who are struggling with self-harm or urges to self-harm. These apps are not a replacement for relational support, safeguarding processes, or clinical care, but they can be helpful tools alongside ongoing support. The first app shown here is Blue Eyes. Blue Eyes is prescribed evidence-based app designed to help young people manage difficult emotions and reduce urges to self-harm. It is typically introduced through clinical or professional settings and focused on helping young people understand their emotional triggers and use coping strategies when urges arise. The slide includes the website where more information about Blue Eyes can be found through Oxford Health NHS. The second app is Calm Harm. Calm Harm is an award-winning app developed for a teenage mental health charity called STEM4 by clinical psychologist Dr. Nihara Krause in collaboration with young people. Calm Harm is based on principles from dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT, which focuses on emotional regulation, distress tolerance, and coping skills. The app offers practical activities that help young people ride out urges to self-harm by distracting, soothing, or helping them reflect until the urge passes. The third app shown is Distract. Distract is an award-winning app that provides trusted information and links to support for people who self-harm and who may also feel suicidal. It brings together coping ideas, grounding techniques, and clear signposting to further help. The website link on the slide shows where this app can be accessed. And when suggesting apps like this, it's important to frame them as optional tools, not expectations. Some young people find digital tools helpful, but particularly outside of school hours or between support sessions. Others may not engage with apps at all, and that's okay. These, these apps work best when they are introduced gently, explained clearly, and offered as a part of wider network of support. This slide highlights Shout, a free confidential text support service available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Shout provides immediate emotional support by text for people who are feeling overwhelmed or distressed, including those who may be struggling with self-harm or difficult thoughts. It can be especially helpful for young people or adults who find it hard to talk on the phone or who feel more comfortable communicating by text. Shout connects users with trained volunteers who listen, help slow things down, and support people to feel less alone in the moment. It is not a therapy service, but a way to access support right now as a part of wider network of care. Services like Shout remind us that help is all available at any time, even when things feel difficult to put in words. As we come to the end of this session, I want to acknowledge the emotional labor involved in this work. Supporting young people who self-harm can be demanding, particularly in systems that are under pressure. Please notice what you are carrying as you finish listening. Take a breath. Stretch or move if you need to. Speak to a colleague or supervisor if something has been stirred. Looking after yourself is part of safeguarding, not separate from it. Thank you for your time, your reflection, and your commitment to supporting young people. You are not alone in this work. Thank you.